Shalom, everybody. Once again, it is Ban Shemayim back with another one. Today's video, we're going to talk about slavery, modern day slavery, because it's these two parents who fostered these black kids and been using them as slaves. But we also wanted to go into another video at the end and correct this lady about what she was saying about slavery, because a lot of the things she was saying was way off and totally wrong. Let's get into it. A West Virginia couple allegedly uses their black adopted children as slaves, locking them in a barn and forcing them to perform farm labor, per Metro News. So this is coming from Metro News. Donald Ray Lance, 63, and Janae K. Whitefeather, 62, were initially arrested in October following a wellness check, during which authorities found two of the couple's 5 adopted children, who are black, locked in a shed on their Sissonville property. Authorities said that the shed only had a small porta potty, no running water. A 16-year-old child told authorities that she had been locked in the building for roughly 12 hours and was last given food around 6 a.m. A 14-year-old boy was found with open sores on his bare feet. Both children were dirty and smelled of body odor, according to the authorities. The teenagers also stated that they were forced to sleep on the concrete floor without a mattress or padding. All right, so I'm going to let somebody break this down, go into video clips of hearing other people talk about it, and then I'll pick back up. Let's get it.
Jean Whitefeather and Donald Lance, a white couple, are accused of treating their 5 adopted children like slaves. We know for sure 3 are black, according to the indictment. Prosecutors say the children were also targeted and adopted because of their race. The pair was arrested last fall. This was after a wellness check turned into a reveal about the living conditions of the children. 2 of the children, 14 and 16 years old, were found living in a barn outside. Neighbors tipped law enforcement off. Deputies discovered there were limited resources in that barn. The teens only had a small porta potty, no running water, or a mattress. According to neighbors, the children were not allowed inside of the home, the main house, and had to do farm labor outside instead. Whitefeather denies the allegations and says the barn was simply a teenage clubhouse. Both Whitefeather and Lance are now behind bars.
In court, Whitefeather claimed that the shed was a teenage clubhouse and the children weren't locked inside. However, neighbors also reported that the children were forced to perform farm labor and were not permitted inside the residence, court documents state. The couple indictment alleges that they specifically targeted the black children and forced them to work because of their race. Kauai County Circuit Judge Marie Claire Akers said that she's never seen an incident like this in her career. It alleges human trafficking, human rights violations, and the use of forced labor. Akers said human rights violations specific to the fact that these children were targeted because of their race, and they were used basically as slaves from what the indictment alleges. Lance told Whitefeather have pleaded not guilty to severe charges, including human trafficking of a minor and the use of a minor child in forced labor and child neglect, creating substantial risk of seriously bodily injury or death. Excuse me, Salakia, for my mess up when I was reading this. I'm going to let the article play after this. They're going to go into kind of over to some of the same things we went over and break it down a little bit more in depthly. Let's get into it.
We do know they were adopted, or they received their custody in Washington State and then moved to West Virginia. Were people wise? Were people getting concerned about what they saw in Washington, and that's why they moved to West Virginia?
I couldn't tell you for what reason they moved them children, but they did pick them up from one place across the country and move into another. So it could be anything. I would have no idea about that. But getting into this next, it says it alleges human trafficking, human rights violations, the use of forced labor. Akers says human rights violations specific to the fact that these children were targeted because of their race and were used basically as slaves from what the incident alleges. right? It says Acre raised their bond from 200,000 to 500,000 each earlier this month. Along with human trafficking, neglect was a serious risk of bodily injuries or death. I don't find the bond to be sufficient, Acre said of her decision. A trial for this case will be is scheduled for September 9th. All right. So as we see, this is all crazy. We're gonna let them talk about it more, but this is 2024, y'all, and this is going on. 2024. And then when we get to the last lady at the end of the video, man, that's gonna be something else too. But it is 2024 and we dealing with this. And this is just what's known. This is just the people who caught. You would have no idea if these people didn't get caught. If this didn't happen, if neighbors didn't call them out for that, right? And there's some important things that they're going to bring up in this video that I definitely think should be talked about, because it is true. Parents lose their children far too easy and then get dumped into somebody else's hands who might not care or love them or even have a heart for kids at all or children at all.
But this is why we should take racism seriously. This is why when people talk about certain things, we should listen to them, because it's so easy to fall back into the trap of yesteryear when things happen that were this atrocious. You know what I mean? It's people would do evil things to people, to innocent people. So we have to really be careful about, you know, the race relations in this country and stuff like that, and so we won't fall back into that trap again.
And of course, we heard from the judge and prosecutors that these kids were targeted because of their race. This is why those parents went after them.
I don't think I've ever seen an indictment like this in all of my time. It alleges human trafficking, human rights violations, the use of forced labor, human rights violations specific to the fact that these children were targeted because of their race.
So that's why we need to take a serious look at the child welfare system. We don't know what happened to these kids, but did you know that only 15% of all cases in which children are taken away from their parents involve physical violence? A lot of them involve neglect. We're talking about maybe there's not enough food at the table, maybe they weren't clothed properly, maybe mom or dad had an addiction problem, things that stem from trauma. If we can address keeping families together and address things like poverty and prosperity and economic prosperity, maybe we can keep families together so we don't see these situations. Something has to seriously be done about that institution.
And we're hearing that they also sold a $700,000 ranch and a $200,000 house, I think, as well. And prosecutors are questioning how they were able to get that money, whether those kids played a role in forced labor to pay for those things.
I mean, we don't know, but it would seem so. Like they had no source of income that the judge knew about. So how are you making this type of money? They're enslaving people. You know, they're trafficking kids. You know, they think it's 1824, not 2024.
Okay, this is from statline.org. When foster care kids are sex trafficked, some states fail to figure it out, right? It says it was simply my means to survive. The nonprofit advocacy organization National Foster Youth Institute estimates up to 60% of child sex trafficking victims are or have been in foster care. 60%, that's a huge number. So it's almost like it's an underground railroad, but for the bad things, for not the good things, right? Not for freedom, but into slavery. Let's continue.
That is nonsense. They are enslaving people. And I've mentioned this before on this show. People think slavery ended in 1865 through convict leasing and other things. Black people have always had to deal with the possibility of being enslaved again. And now in 2024, we have kids having to go through things that my ancestors went through. And it's horrifying.
Last 30 seconds.
14% of this country is a black population, yet 25% of all kids in the child welfare system are black. There's a serious racism problem in the foster care and the child welfare system.
Now, this is from importantnews.org, a history of exploiting America's foster youth, part 1, right? It says some families even took in groups of foster children merely to work on their farms and ranches. They were more like slaves than family members. This was especially true after the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution abolished slavery at the end of the Civil War in 1865. So this practice started happening so long ago, and it's still continuing to this day. Now check this out from Quora.com. This is a question somebody asked. They said, is using my foster child as a slave For me and my biological child, okay. The fact that they asked that question is crazy, and people are giving them answers. So it's not like it's crazy. If you look this type of stuff up, people are asking about it and trying to figure out how they could do it without getting in trouble in 2024. Now I'm about to introduce the next section. We have this lady who's talking about slavery and talking about reparations, and a lot of the things she says is wrong. I do not currently have her name to give to y'all at this time, so I might find it and try to put it in the title. I really don't think it's that important. I'm gonna just try to clean up the lies with the facts.
People of all colors became slaves for economic reasons, because of war, because slavery, as odious as it was simply a normal way of life. Arabs were extracting millions of black African slaves centuries before Christian nations did, for about 13 centuries, compared to the 3 centuries European nations ran the Atlantic slave trade. Arabs marched African slaves across the Sahara Desert, and as such, they died more often. It was customary to castrate them, and many died from this practice. The Arabs also enslaved over 1 million white European Christians. The term slave...
First off, there's no way to know if the Arab slave trade caused more deaths, because the deaths range from different things. You hear 10 million, you hear 15 million. There's some stories of up to 200 million people dying being brought over here on slave ships. So there's no way to compare that, right? So let's get into the actual things that we can, some of the history, because she talked about white people, Christians, being taken by the Muslims. So let's go into why that happened. The link existing between piracy and the capture of human beings in the Western Mediterranean Sea during the medieval period is undeniable. However, it is a link that is associated almost exclusively with the piracy between Christians and Muslims. Christians' piracy against Christians was interested above all in seizing goods. So Christians wanted to take precious goods and wealth away from other Christians, right? While Christian piracy against Muslims, or Islamic piracy against Christians, was basically interested in capturing humans. So during this time of war, they were capturing each other. Christians were capturing Muslims, and Muslims was capturing Christians. Notice that lady never mentioned. She mentioned 1 million Christians getting captured by the Islamic nation, right? She didn't mention any of the Islamic people being taken as slaves by the Christians. Slavery has violence inherent in both, in the everyday life of the enslaved people and in the ways in which most people became slaves. Many were captured in war or kidnapped. Piracy was epidemic to the Mediterranean during the Middle Ages. We might think of pirates as freebooters, acting against or at least with no regard for the law. In Western Mediterranean, that was not always the case. Pirates and the merchant marines were not clearly distinct groups. Crusade and conquest relied heavily on private vessels. During the 13th century, the Count Kings in the Crown of Aragon sought to regulate the active commerce in the Muslim world, right? So we gonna wrap this up and get to the next one. Let's get it. Countries or regions with whom King Jamum's reign were at war were fair game, while those who came from areas or communities with surrender treaties from the king or established Mujadar al-James, that is, recognized Muslim communities under his rule, were not. Muslims living under Christian rule in the Iberian Peninsula could be enslaved for crimes by judicial penalty. So that means if they broke a law or a rule, they could then be enslaved because of their crimes. It might be penalized for the rebellion, but were not supposed to be kidnapped and sold out of hand, meaning that they could only be punished for the crime. They could not be taken from the area that they were in and sold to another person. But were not supposed to be kidnapped or sold out of hand. Only Muslims who were considered enemies of the faith were legally fair game to be enslaved through the violent confrontation or capture. King Juwami's conquest of Malarica in 1229, Valencia in 1238, and ongoing after, and his grandson Alfonso III's taking of Minorca in 1287, were accompanied by the sale of many of the conquered military companions that sought to cull North African powers, like the attacks of El Peri Grand, Peter the Great, in 1282 on Tunis, also yielded captives, right? So it's showing that this was a war. We know that this was a war over that land that they're still fighting over to this day, that the Bible says would be split in two. They were warring over Jerusalem, over the Middle East, over that area, over God's people area, over our homeland. They were warring over it. And because of their wars, they were taking each other captives and prisoners. That's what was happening. So when this lady is talking about slavery, context is important. You got to put the context to why people were slaves. Let's go.
The term slavery, in fact, comes from the word Slav.
She said slavery comes from the word Slav. Listen, it says the more slaves you had, the wealthier and more influential you were. The oldest known slave society was the Mesopotamian Sumerian civilization located in Iran/Iraq region between 6000 and 2000 BCE, before Christ was here, right? Which was thousands of years before the Slavs was ever recognized. They didn't come around till about 900 AD, after the death of Christ.
The Slavs inhabited Eastern Europe and were taken by the Muslims of Spain in the 9th century.
Notice she keeps mentioning the Muslims like they were the only ones who participated in slavery, right? It says some Egyptian languages refer to slave-like people as squana, meaning living prisoner, prisoner of war. Forms of forced labor and servitude are seen throughout all of ancient Egypt. Egyptians wanted dominion over their kingdom and would alter political and social ideas to benefit their economic state. It says servi, Roman slaves, were an underclass, often prisoners of war, debtors of the children of slaves, but the Roman slaves were called servi, which is understandably sounds like servant. Public servant came from how Roman slaves weren't just unskilled laborers, but we all imagine, but were used for all kinds of jobs. The reason I brought this up is to show that slaves or servants or anything like that came way before the Slavs had ever existed. And she's taking things way out of context and misconstruing things by trying to say that slaves, the word slave started with these people. The action of slavery didn't. All right, and the word slave really didn't either. The modern word slave, but not the definition of what it means to be a slave.
Not to mention that Africans had been enslaving each other for thousands of years. The point is that slavery, the second point is that slavery was not about race, and that's important. It was not about race. The only reason we think it's about race is because philosophers like David Hume in the 18th century ranked human beings and put Africans at the bottom, saying that they had no souls. The Enlightenment imposed the concept of race on a practice that had been going on for centuries in order to justify that practice. And why did they have to justify it? And this is the point. Because people in the West began to question slavery's moral validity.
First off, that was absolutely nonsense. She said because of the West. That's why slavery stopped, because of the West. Who was the first country to get rid of slavery? Haiti was. Let's get it. It says, Haiti, then Saint Domingue, formally declared independence from France in 1804, and it became the first nation in the Western Hemisphere to permanently eliminate slavery in the modern era, following the 1804 Haitian Massacre. It says, following the 1804 Haitian Massacre, the northern states in the U.S. all abolished slavery by 1804. So what does that sound like to y'all? Like fear. It wasn't because they abolished slavery because we felt like it was the wrong thing to do. It was morally wrong. That's not the reason that they abolished slavery. They abolished it because they were afraid, and this is why. You had the Haiti taken over in 1804, and then you also had the Gullah Wars, which went from the Gullah Geechee Wars, as some will call it, which went from 1739 to 1858. You had black people and natives fighting against the Western colonizers. So it was fear. It had nothing to do with, oh, we just had a moral change and we had to do things differently. Madness.
The fact is that people of all colors owned slaves, both as part of the Atlantic slave trade and outside of it. In the United States and Caribbean, black people owned thousands of black slaves.
Notice how she doubled down. Black people, and pointed her finger and everything, without giving really any detail or information about that. Let's get into this. Free blacks in the antebellum period, the African American Odyssey. So this is talking about that time that she's talking about. The slaves that most free blacks purchased were relatives of whom they later manumitted. A few free blacks also owned slaves holding plantations, right? So we have to separate that there was a difference. When they say that black people, Africans have been enslaving Africans for years, there were two different type of people. When Israel was enslaved by Egypt, they were both black, but they were two different distinct type of people, right? So we can't marginalize all people the same. And this shows you that it's bigger than just the color. It's actually about your race or your origin.
And so did the Native Americans. Nearly 20,000 of the Native American 5 civilized tribes sided with the Confederacy during the Civil War, fighting to keep slavery alive.
See, she threw out those facts without throwing out the context behind the facts. Let's get into the context, y'all. It says, Native Americans adopt slavery from white settlers in the late 1700s and early 1800s. So you see that they got it from white people. And some tribes began owning and enslaving black people as domestic and agriculture laborers. This was part of a larger effort to assimilate into European society and avoid removal from their lands. Some reasons Native Americans may have owned slaves, right? So they were trying to do this so they wouldn't have to leave their land, so they could fit in. Get in where you fit in, as some people say, right? It says, to defend themselves. Some tribes believed that owning slaves would help them maintain their southern lands and avoid federal pressure. Who is the federal people? The white people. It says to prove civilization. Native Americans may have owned slaves to show white settlers that they were sophisticated in complying with governmental demands. So they wanted to, remember, they were known as Indians or savages, right? They weren't known as having the smarts or intellects, even though that's false. So they wanted to seem like they had the smarts or intellect. The third one is to keep captives out of English households. Native Americans may have requested captives as servants to keep them away from English households, meaning that some of the natives, like we read from the Gullah Geechees, was trying to keep black people away from white people, which is how the Gullah Geechees freed slaves, came together and fought that war against white people for over 100 years.
28% of the black population who were free in New Orleans pledged their support to the Confederacy.
You got to watch people like her, because you notice she threw out the percentage without giving any, like I said, any detailed understanding. She's shaping the argument without dropping the full facts, right? It says blacks who shouldered arms for the Confederacy numbered more than 3,000, but fewer than 10,000. He said among the hundreds of thousands of whites who served. So among the hundreds of thousands of people, there was only 3,000 to 10,000 who actually served. You see how she threw out that 28% to make it seem like it was a lot? Check this out. It says in 1860, 47% of the population was in slavery. That's in Louisiana. However, Louisiana also had one of the largest free black populations in the United States. On January 26, 1861, Louisiana seceded from the United States, right? So even though it had a free black population that was huge, it had a huge population of slavery still as well. And I noticed this is one of the things that they don't teach us. It's how black people fought for their freedom. They only want to give us credit for fighting when we fought in the Civil War, not all the other things. People need to know this. Not 100% of America was never enslaved because we fought against it.
All of the 13 southern states of the Confederacy had substantial numbers of black slave owners. There were more than 250,000 free blacks, and nearly 4,000 of them were slave masters who owned more than 20,000 slaves. The practice of slavery was legal, after all. We need to remember that governments did not own slaves. Slave owners did.
She says the government didn't own slaves, slave owners did, as if that takes any of the pressure off of the government to have to reimburse because of slavery. The government made money off of slavery. Let's go into it. It says, until the issue was resolved, enslaved people were taxed as persons rather than as property, based on the Constitutional Convention of 1835. No levy was imposed on enslaved people under the age of 12 and over the age of 50. All others were assessed at an amount and not to exceed the poll tax for white men. So they tax you based upon the age of the people and the labor they thought that you could get out of them. So you were taxed. The government made money off of that for decades, for hundreds of years. And yes, they should have to pay that back.
Not own slaves. Slave owners did. In fact, the U.S. government fought a war to end slavery.
She go from one lie to another, y'all. The Civil War was never about slavery. Let's get it. Initially, the Civil War between the North and the South was fought by the North to prevent the secession of the Southern states and pressure the Union. Even though sectional conflicts over slavery had been a major cause of the war, ending slavery was not a goal of the war. See, the things they don't like to talk about is how the people in the Union also treated black people bad during that time of war. It wasn't like they were just welcomed with jolly arms and they weren't treated down, and they weren't that like they were all treated equal and treated with love with the Union, and the white people just wanted to go fight to protect black people so black people didn't die. This is not what happened in the Holocaust. Unlike the Holocaust, where it was planned to fight for a specific people and to help out people, during our Holocaust that we're still currently going through, it has never been a plan to fight for us. It just so happened that our goals aligned and they needed us to win the Civil War, and that is a fact.
How much should the descendants of the 400,000 Union soldiers who lost their lives fighting to free the slaves pay to the descendants of the slaves they freed? Giving people lump sums of money does not work.
Since she brought it up, let's go into it. We're going to discuss the Holocaust because I had just brought it up previously. It says the Holocaust was the genocide of European Jews during World War II between 1941 and 1945. That's 4 years, y'all. Nazi Germany and its collaborators systematically murdered some 6 million Jews across German-occupied Europe. Around 2/3 of Europe's Jews were murdered, right? And this is the thing about that. There is no guarantee on that number. Nobody knows that number. Is estimated, just like slavery and how many people died during slavery, where some people estimate up to 200 million people died during slavery. Those are both estimated numbers. How much U.S. aid does Israel receive? Israel has been the largest cumulative recipient of U.S. foreign aid since its founding, receiving about $310 billion adjusted for inflation. In total economic and military assistance, the United States has also provided large foreign aid packages to Middle Eastern countries, particularly Egypt and Iraq, but Israel stands apart. So we got about 300 billion plus for Israel. Egypt is over 100 billion, close to 200 billion. Afghanistan is over 100 billion, close to 200 billion. Remember, they took their country back from us. South Vietnam, Ukraine is at over 100 billion. South Vietnam's over 100 billion. Iraq is barely under 100 billion. South Korea is barely under 100 billion. The United Kingdom is barely under 100 billion. So when she's saying these things, so when she's mentioning things like giving people money never helps. It never helps anybody to give anybody money. Why do we give so much money away? And I just counted, this is American aid. Knowing, Germany pays Israel. The UK pays Israel. All these other countries is giving them money for what they went through as a Holocaust. And that's an example or an exemption for them, because they can do fine. If you give them money, they can support themselves. But if you give our people money, it won't help. They're still going to be in the same situation. It won't change anything. And it's so crazy is right after this next clip, when she finished talking, she's about to contradict herself once again real fast too.
Economists often point to the Georgia Land Lottery of 1832, in which parcels of land were distributed randomly. What happened to the descendants of those who were lucky enough to be given this land? Are they the richest families in Georgia? No. In fact, within one generation after the distribution of the Georgia land, one could not distinguish between those who had been given land and those who hadn't. Certainly my own direct experiences of working for 20 plus years in the inner city with families on welfare demonstrates this time and time again. Rather than give a man a fish, it is always better to teach him how to fish. All giving the fish does is make the giver feel better.
First off, let's hit that saying she said. You teach a man how to fish, you don't give him a fish. No. That's wrong. If a man is hungry, you give him a fish. And then you can teach him how to fish, and he can get his fish from then on out. But when he's hungry, you got to give him what he needs first, or else he won't even have the energy to get the fish. And the second thing, she brought up how these people receive this money or receive this land, and then a generation later, they were no different from anybody else who hadn't received the land, without going into the context of what was their social status, what was their social condition before they received the land. Because if they lived in poverty and was below the social standard before they received the land, in a generation after they received the land, now they're equal to social standard. Then you got equality, like this definition states, right? The state of being equal, especially in status, rights, and opportunities, right? So then you get equality. So without her saying it didn't help them at all, no, it did help them, because now they were equal to everybody else. If they started off lower in the race and then they received the land in a generation after they received the land, they're equal in the race to everybody else. That's equality. So that land did help them. Nobody ever said that the land had to make them be the richest people ever in the world. That was never stated. Stats without context doesn't help anything. So when she's talking about how these people were poor and then they received land, or she didn't even go over that. She just said that they received land and they wasn't the richest ever. After a generation, they were equal to everybody else who hadn't received land. But what was their poverty situation before that? And without giving that context, that makes that whole statement she said invalid. I wanted to go over all types of slavery. So let's go over the white people who were sent to America to be slaves, right? Not many people know that between 1718 and 1775, over 52,000 convicts were transported from the British Isles to America, mainly to Maryland and Virginia, to be sold as slaves to the highest bidder. It is reckoned that transported convicts made up a quarter of the British immigrants to the colonial America in the 18th century. Right? So we're going to go a little deeper into this, because one thing she did not paint a good argument of is that all slavery was different. Like, she talked about it just a tad bit, how some come from war. I don't think she even went into they came from crimes, but she might have, and I might just be mistaken. But some slavery came from crime. Most slavery comes from war, And some slavery came from you committing crime, and that was part of your sentence. Another faction of slavery was you being indebted. We weren't at war with anybody. We weren't indebted to anybody except for God. You understand? So what happened to us was an anomaly. And it didn't just happen in that one specific time. It's happened over and over through history with us being God's people, right? Over and over. They were then released back onto the streets to commit more crimes, or they were hanged because the jails were not intended for long-term incarceration. There was nothing in between, right? So you were either whipped and released back during that time in Europe, or you were hung. There was no other option for them. After passing the act, transportation became the main punishment at the court's disposal. From May 1718 to the outbreak of the American War of Independence in 1775, over 70% of those who were found guilty at the Old Bailey were sentenced to be transported, compared with less than 1% of the period from 1700 to March 1718, right? So they were now being transported. White people were being transported over here for committing crimes to serve out a sentence. It's not the same as what we endured during slavery. Although it was in the captain's interest to make sure the convicts survived the voyage so that they could receive their share of the sale proceeds, the convicts on board the ships in many cases were treated worse than slaves. The captains had more reason for trying to make sure that the slaves survived. The death of a slave was more of a material loss than the death of a convict. Slaves commanded a much higher price. Slaves were more attractive to potential buyers than convicts. They were more trustworthy as they did not have a criminal record, and they were generally fitter, stronger, and healthier. Slaves were sold for life, whereas most convicts were sold for 70-year terms. Slaves were sold between $30 to $60. Most male convicts were sold between $10 to $14, while most women went between $5 to $9. Convicts were often brought by poor planters who could not afford to buy slaves. And it's crazy because I found a contradiction in what I was reading. It says that the convicts were treated worse than slaves normally on the ships, but it said that the captains had more of a reason trying to make sure the slaves survived, right, than the convicts, because the convicts weren't trustworthy. But at the same time, the convicts had a shorter sentence. They weren't sentenced to life. They weren't sentenced to death. Where slaves were death, they were just considered to be a tool to be used and thrown away. A convict actually still had a life. He was just serving out a sentence. So I find a bit of a contradiction in that language. But the bottom line, the bottom point comes to this. There was many different forms of slavery, but most actually had a reasoning. Maybe not the most logical, but it was still a reasoning. There was a justification behind it. There was a holy war between the Muslims and the Christians, right? And they had slavery on both sides because of the holy war, right? There was people committing crimes and they didn't know what to do with the people besides hang them and kill them. So to give them a chance to still be able to live life, they sent people to be slaves for 7-year terms or 14-year terms, depending, I guess, on what the crime was, right? There's many times and many facets in many ways, but only for our people, it seems like, if you go through the history, only through our people were we just targeted to be slaves for no other reason but who we are. And that's the same thing that's happened to God's people over and over and over again in the Bible. So when people like this lady is talking about we don't deserve reparations and trying to belittle slavery, let me tell you, we already got it coming. They don't have to give us a dime. God, Christ, he got it prepared for us. Yeshua Wamasiach, he got it prepared for us. Our reparations for what we suffered, what our ancestors suffered, and the punishment for them for what they have done. There's a scripture that says if you give back all the things that you have taken, right, that God will go lighter on them if they return the things that they stole from his people. So in their best interest, it's in their best interest to give us reparations. Matter of fact, there's another scripture that says that talking about when we leave, when we're done with our 400 years, that we will come out with great substance. Now, I do believe that we will come out with the Spirit of God as well. But there's another scripture that talks about us being in the wilderness and being peaceful and secure and having everything we needed with wealth and gold. And the nations getting mad, right, and coming after us because they see us secure with wealth out in the wilderness. And we didn't get the wealth. I mean, I'm just assuming, guesstimating, but it's not likely that we got the wealth in the wilderness. It's most likely we got it in this place. Like there's another scripture that says, there's another scripture that says in that same place that it was told you are not the seed of God, you're not the children of God, that it would be known that you are the living child of God, right? And I believe that once the world knows that there probably will be some form of reparations. But let me tell you, we probably gonna go through a lot of mess before we get to that point. So just be prepared for the times that's coming. Watch your back. Know that these people will lie and manipulate things to make it to their advantage. They always try to down what we went through in history and what we go through every day, modern day. What we still go through every day. They try to downplay it. And what's so crazy is the lady in that video, she would have probably been a slave. A house slave, but she would have probably been a slave. They would have probably enslaved her. There's plenty of countries that if she go to in the world that would be treating her pretty roughly, including Libya, which we're reading about right here. And it says, according to the State Department's 2024 Tracking in Persons Report, an international organization estimated January 2024 that 4,000 to 10,000 migrants and refugees have been held in detention centers in Libya, including many trafficking victims. Human Rights Watch 2024's World Report also found that enslavement, sexual slavery, and other human rights abuses were widespread in Libya, including arbitrary detentions, torture, rapes, and extrajudicial killings. And this is in 2024 this is being reported and recorded. So this is not something that was old. This is something that is prevalent in modern day society is happening. And people need to be aware of it and be watchful of it. Because let me tell you, don't think that we live in 2024 that they won't come back after us. Because not only will they come back after us, it's prophesied that they'll come back after us. On that note, shalom, barakatah, until the next time.